When Congresswoman Crockett unveiled White House Press Secretary Leavitt's secret playbook on live television, the explosive confrontation that followed exposed the dark underbelly of political messaging and set Washington ablaze. The television studio lights bore down mercilessly as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett adjusted her microphone, maintaining the composed demeanor she'd become known for. Across from her sat Karoline Leavitt, the youthful White House assistant press secretary, exuding confidence with her practiced camera-ready smile. The CNN moderator had promised a civil discussion on recent legislative priorities, but anyone familiar with the history between these two women knew better. The tension in the air was palpable, a powder keg waiting for a spark. "Thank you both for joining us tonight," the moderator began smoothly. "Let's start with the administration's recent claims about congressional obstruction. Secretary Leavitt, your office has specifically called out certain representatives as being, quote, deliberately obstructionist without offering alternatives. Would you care to elaborate?" Leavitt leaned forward slightly, her expression shifting to one of practiced concern. "Absolutely. What we're seeing is a pattern of behavior from certain members who seem more interested in creating media moments than in actual governance. They show up, they make accusations, they pound the table, but when it comes to actual policy solutions, there's nothing there." Though Leavitt hadn't named names, her gaze flickered briefly toward Crockett. The implication was crystal clear. Crockett's eyebrow raised slightly, but she remained silent, jotting something in her notepad as Leavitt continued. "The American people deserve better than performative outrage," Leavitt added. "They deserve representatives who come to the table with solutions, not just complaints." The moderator turned. "Congresswoman Crockett, I'm sure you'd like to respond to that." "I would, thank you." Crockett's voice was measured, controlled. "It's interesting to hear Secretary Leavitt talk about performance when that seems to be the administration's specialty. We've offered numerous policy alternatives that have been summarily dismissed without consideration. Just last month, our committee put forward 3 separate compromise proposals on infrastructure funding that were rejected without discussion." Leavitt shook her head, interjecting, "Those proposals were fiscally irresponsible, and you know it." "What I know," Crockett replied evenly, "is that characterizing women of color in Congress as angry or emotional rather than engaging with their ideas has become something of a strategy for this administration." Leavitt's expression hardened. "That's an unfair characterization, and frankly, it's the kind of divisive rhetoric that—" "Is it unfair?" Crockett interrupted, reaching into her portfolio. "Because I have something here that suggests otherwise." The studio fell silent as Crockett withdrew a document. The camera zoomed in as she placed it on the table between them. "This is an internal communications memo from your office dated 3 months ago. It specifically outlines a media strategy to, and I quote, undermine credibility of minority female representatives by emphasizing emotional responses and aggressive behavior while downplaying policy positions." Leavitt's face paled visibly. "I don't know what you're talking about. Where did you get that?" "It was provided to me by a concerned staffer who was troubled by the explicit targeting of women of color in Congress," Crockett replied calmly. "It has your signature on the approval line, Secretary Leavitt." The moderator, clearly caught off guard, leaned forward. "Congresswoman, are you saying you have evidence of a deliberate strategy to discredit female representatives based on race?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Crockett confirmed, sliding the document toward the moderator. "Page 3 outlines specific language to use when referring to me and several of my colleagues. Words like angry, emotional, aggressive, the very words Secretary Leavitt has used repeatedly in press briefings when asked about our policy proposals." Leavitt's composure cracked. This is completely taken out of context. That document is not what you're making it out to be." "It's exactly what I'm saying it is," Crockett countered, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Leavitt's growing agitation. "And it explains a pattern we've observed for months, Rather than engaging with our ideas, this administration has chosen to paint women like me as angry caricatures. Leavitt's face flushed. You set me up. You arranged this whole thing to ambush me on national television. Her voice rose sharply. This was supposed to be a discussion about legislative priorities. And part of that discussion, Crockett replied, is how certain voices are systematically silenced or discredited. How can we have an honest conversation about priorities when your office has a written strategy to undermine representatives based on their gender and race rather than their ideas? The moderator tried to regain control. Secretary Leavitt, would you like to respond directly to the document Congresswoman Crockett has presented? This is absurd. Leavitt's voice cracked slightly. You're giving credibility to a stolen document that's been completely misrepresented. This is exactly the kind of theatrical performance that distracts from real issues. Is acknowledging systematic bias not a real issue? Crockett asked. Because the language in this memo matches exactly what you just said about performative outrage. Cameras captured Leavitt's expression cycling through shock, anger, and calculation. The studio lights seemed even hotter now as she reached for her water glass with a trembling hand. You don't understand the pressures of working in the White House, Leavitt finally said, her voice lower but intense. Every day we're dealing with attacks from all sides. Communication strategies consider all aspects of messaging, but that doesn't mean you should have a specific playbook for discrediting black women in Congress, Crockett finished for her. Because that's what this is, Secretary Leavitt, a playbook, with your signature. The moderator, sensing the conversation spiraling, attempted to pivot. Perhaps we should— No, Leavitt snapped, surprising even herself with her vehemence. I won't sit here and be accused like this. That document is being misrepresented. We develop messaging strategies for dealing with all opposition figures. This isn't about race or gender. Then why, Crockett asked, sliding another paper forward, does this companion memo specifically identify minority female representatives as, quote, particularly vulnerable to characterization, as emotionally driven rather than policy-focused? And why does it instruct press officials to emphasize tone and delivery over content when responding to challenges from this group? The studio fell deadly silent. The camera caught Leavitt's expression freezing, her media training seemingly deserting her as she stared at the second document. Where did you get these? She finally whispered. As I said, a concerned staffer who believes Americans deserve better than manipulation and character assassination instead of policy debate, Crockett responded. The question now is whether you're going to continue denying what's in black and white in front of you, or whether you're ready to have an honest conversation about how women of color in politics are systematically undermined. The tension in the studio was electric. Viewers across America leaned closer to their screens, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. The careful facade of political messaging cracking open to reveal the calculated machinery beneath. Leavitt's hand slammed down on the table with unexpected force, causing the water glasses to jump. The sound echoed through the silent studio. This is completely unethical, she exclaimed, her voice rising. Bringing allegedly stolen internal documents to a televised discussion without prior notice? This is nothing but a political hit job. The moderator attempted to regain control. Secretary Leavitt, if you could please— No, I will not be silenced on this, Leavitt cut in, color flooding her cheeks. The Congresswoman has orchestrated this entire situation. She's proving exactly the point our communications team has made privately, that instead of discussing actual policy, she resorts to personal attacks and theatrics. Crockett remained unmoved, her expression calm as she watched Leavitt's composure disintegrate. I find it interesting, Secretary Leavitt, that when confronted with evidence of your own strategy, you immediately call it a hit job and label me as theatrical, the exact language your memo prescribes. The camera panned between them, capturing The stark contrast, Leavitt visibly flustered, papers scattered before her, versus Crockett's measured demeanor and organized portfolio. What the American people are witnessing right now, Crockett continued, is the real-time implementation of a strategy designed to undermine women who look like me. When we speak truth to power, we're labeled as aggressive. When we present evidence, we're accused of theatrics. Leavitt took a deep breath, visibly trying to recenter herself. Those documents, if they're even authentic, are internal communications protected by executive privilege. The fact that you somehow obtained them raises serious legal questions. About what? Crockett interjected. About the ethics of exposing a deliberate attempt to silence and discredit elected officials based on their race and gender. The American people deserve to know when their representatives are being systematically undermined rather than engaged with on policy. The moderator finally managed to interject. Secretary Leavitt, would you like to address the specific content of the memos rather than their source? Leavitt straightened her jacket, struggling to regain her professional demeanor. Those documents represent draft communication strategies that were discussed but never officially implemented. Every administration considers various messaging approaches. So you're acknowledging their authenticity now? Crockett asked. Leavitt froze momentarily, realizing her misstep. I'm saying that without seeing the full context, no one watching can make an informed judgment about. Page 4, paragraph 2, Crockett said, sliding the document toward the camera. Quote, when addressing Representatives Crockett, Bush, Lee, or Ocasio-Cortez, emphasize emotional language and disruptive behavior. Avoid engaging with policy specifics which may legitimize their positions. End quote. What context could possibly justify this, Secretary Leavitt? The studio fell, silent again as the camera zoomed in on the highlighted text. This is not who we are supposed to be as a democracy, Crockett continued, her voice dropping to a more intimate tone that somehow carried more weight than if she'd shouted. We can disagree on policy. We can debate the merits of legislation. But when an administration deliberately works to undermine certain voices based not on what they say, but on who they are, that's a threat to representative government itself. Leavitt's phone had begun buzzing incessantly. The White House was clearly monitoring the unfolding disaster. She glanced down at it briefly before pushing it aside. You've clearly come here with an agenda, Congresswoman, Leavitt said, attempting to regain the offensive. And it's interesting that you chose to do this on live television rather than through proper channels. Proper channels? Crockett echoed, with a raised eyebrow. Like the ethics committee I approached 3 weeks ago, who received a direct call from your office suggesting they dismiss my concerns without investigation. Those proper channels? Leavitt's expression confirmed the truth before she could formulate a denial. Or perhaps, Crockett continued, you mean the House Oversight Committee, where your office submitted a letter characterizing my inquiry as, quote, politically motivated harassment lacking substantive merit? Were those the proper channels you had in mind? The moderator, sensing an opportunity for a commercial break, began to speak, but Leavitt unexpectedly cut her off. You know what? Fine. Let's talk about this, she said, her tone suddenly shifting to one of defiance. Politics is a tough business. Congresswoman, every public figure gets scrutinized, gets criticized. The fact that you're trying to make this about race or gender rather than your own political vulnerabilities speaks volumes. Does it? Crockett replied evenly. Then perhaps, you can explain why there's no equivalent memo about white male representatives. No strategic document outlining how to characterize them as emotional or aggressive, regardless of the content of their arguments? Leavitt opened her mouth, then closed it again. The American people aren't stupid, Secretary Leavitt, Crockett continued. They can see what's happening here. When women of color speak up, there's a playbook for dismissing them that has nothing to do with their ideas and everything to do with who they are. That's not fair, Leavitt said, her voice quieter, now but trembling with intensity. You have no idea the pressures we face, the constant scrutiny, the impossible standards." "I don't?" Crockett interrupted, leaning forward. "Every woman in this room knows exactly what it's like to have her ideas dismissed, to be judged by different standards, to work twice as hard for half the credit. The difference is, I don't have a team developing strategies to silence others based on their identity." The tension between them was almost tangible. Two powerful women locked in a confrontation that had transcended the typical political sparring match. This wasn't just about a memo anymore. It was about the unspoken rules that governed who got heard in American politics and who got silenced. "What exactly do you want from me here?" Leavitt finally asked, her voice barely audible. The question hung in the air, genuine in its vulnerability. For a moment, the careful constructs of political theater fell away, leaving two women staring at each other across a divide that suddenly seemed both vast and surprisingly intimate. "Accountability," Crockett answered simply. "Not just from you personally, but from a system that thinks this kind of targeting is acceptable strategy rather than what it really is, a form of silencing." The moderator, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, leaned forward. "Secretary Leavitt, would you like to respond to that?" Leavitt's fingers drummed nervously against the table as all eyes fixed on her. The studio lights seemed to intensify, highlighting the perspiration on her forehead. She glanced toward the production booth, perhaps hoping for a producer to signal a commercial break that wasn't coming. She began, then stopped, clearly wrestling with competing instincts, the political reflex to deflect and the human urge toward honesty in a moment of unexpected authenticity. "I would say that communication strategies are complex and often misunderstood when taken out of context." Crockett shook her head slightly. "That's not accountability, Secretary Leavitt. That's another deflection." Something shifted in Leavitt's expression then, a recognition that the usual playbook wasn't working. She straightened her shoulders and looked directly at Crockett. "You're right," she said quietly, the admission hanging in the air like a thunderclap. "Not about everything, but about enough that I can't sit here and defend this document in good faith." The moderator's eyebrows shot up in visible surprise. "These memos," Leavitt continued, tapping the papers between them, "represent an approach I inherited when I took this position. I signed off on them without fully considering their implications. That was a failure of leadership on my part." Crockett remained silent, allowing Leavitt the space to continue. "Politics has become so reflexively adversarial that we sometimes forget we're talking about colleagues, about fellow Americans who want what's best for this country, even when we disagree about how to get there." Leavitt's voice grew steadier as she spoke. "The language in these memos is indefensible. Full stop." A palpable wave of tension released in the studio, though Crockett's expression remained measured, waiting to see if this acknowledgement would lead to substantive change or merely serve as a momentary performance of contrition. "That said," Leavitt continued, her tone shifting slightly, "I reject the implication that this administration as a whole endorses any strategy that targets representatives based on race or gender. This was a serious lapse in judgment within our communications team, and I take full responsibility for it. Taking responsibility means more than acknowledging a mistake when caught," Crockett responded, her voice firm but not unkind. "It means committing to concrete action to ensure it doesn't happen again." "What would you suggest?" Leavitt asked, and there was something in her tone that suggested a genuine question rather than a defensive challenge. "For starters," Crockett said, "a comprehensive review of all communication strategies to identify and eliminate language that targets individuals based on identity rather than policy positions. Second, diversity in leadership positions within your communications team with the authority to flag problematic approaches before they become official strategy. And third, a public commitment from this administration to engage with policy proposals on their merits, regardless of who presents them." Leavitt nodded slowly. "Those are reasonable requests. I can commit to the first two immediately." The third would require consultation with others in the administration. But I personally believe it's the right approach. The moderator, seemingly stunned by the unexpected turn toward productive dialogue, finally found her voice. This is quite a moment we're witnessing. Secretary Leavitt, are you saying that the White House will change its communications strategy as a result of Congresswoman Crockett bringing these documents forward? I'm saying that I will advocate for that change, yes, Leavitt responded, meeting Crockett's gaze directly. Not because we were exposed, though that's clearly part of it, but because it's the right thing to do. The American people deserve better than political theater from all of us. Crockett nodded, acknowledging the sentiment while maintaining her focus. Words matter, Secretary Leavitt, but actions matter more. I look forward to seeing these commitments implemented. I understand your skepticism, Leavitt replied. It's earned. All I can say is that I'll be held accountable for what happens next. The tension in the studio had transformed from hostile confrontation to something more complex. Two adversaries finding unexpected common ground while still maintaining clear boundaries. The moderator, sensing an opportunity to elevate the discussion, asked, "Do you think this moment represents something larger about the state of political discourse in America?" "I do," Crockett answered thoughtfully. "What we've seen here tonight is both the problem and potentially part of the solution. The problem is that too often we focus on discrediting the messenger rather than engaging with the message. Women, in politics, especially women of color, face this constantly. We're told we're too angry, too emotional, too ambitious, too everything except what we actually are, representatives doing the job our constituents elected us to do." Leavitt nodded, a gesture that would have seemed impossible just minutes earlier. "And the solution?" "The solution starts with honesty," Crockett replied. "With acknowledging the problem exists, as you just did. With creating accountability mechanisms that aren't dependent on someone having to expose wrongdoing on national television. And with recognizing that disagreement doesn't have to mean disrespect." "I agree with that," Leavitt said, and there was a note of genuine reflection in her voice. "Though I think it's fair to say that both sides of the aisle have contributed to the deterioration of political discourse." "This isn't about both sides," Crockett countered firmly. "This is about specific documented strategies to undermine specific representatives based on their identity. Let's not dilute that with false equivalence." Leavitt took a breath, visibly stopping herself from falling back into defensive patterns. "You're right. I apologize." The moderator looked between them. "Secretary Leavitt, will there be any immediate changes to how the White House Communications Office operates as a result of tonight's discussion?" "Yes," Leavitt said with unexpected decisiveness. "First, I'll be meeting with our entire communications team tomorrow morning to review all current messaging strategies. Second, I'm establishing an external review panel with diverse representation to evaluate our communications practices and make recommendations for improvement. And third," she paused, seeming to make a decision in real time, "I'd like to invite Congresswoman Crockett and several of her colleagues to participate in direct dialogue with our team about how we can do better." Crockett raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the invitation. "I appreciate that offer and would be willing to participate, provided it's a substantive discussion rather than a photo opportunity." "I wouldn't expect anything less," Leavitt replied with the ghost of a smile. As the segment drew to a close, the moderator addressed the viewing audience. "What we've witnessed tonight is extraordinary by any measure. A confrontation that began with explosive allegations and ended with commitments to concrete action. Whether this represents a momentary breakthrough or a lasting change in political communication remains to be seen." The cameras captured a final image of the two women, no longer adversaries in the traditional sense, but representatives of fundamentally different approaches to power, finding unexpected common ground in a moment of authenticity. 3 days later, Leavitt held the promised meeting with her communications team. A week after that, the external review panel was announced, with membership including respected communications ethics experts from across the political spectrum. And true to her word, Leavitt extended formal invitations to Crockett and 4 other Congresswomen to participate in a closed-door session on messaging reform. The media cycle moved on as it always does, but something had shifted in the national conversation. Political commentators dissected the exchange endlessly, some cynically dismissing it as performance on both sides, others recognizing it as a rare moment of genuine accountability in an era of reflexive defensiveness. For her part, Crockett continued her work in Congress, neither declaring victory nor expressing doubt about Leavitt's commitments. When asked about it in subsequent interviews, she would only say, "Judge by actions, not words." The work of making our democracy more responsive and representative continues regardless of who's watching. The story had no neat ending because the issues at its heart, representation, respect, the tactics of political messaging, remained ongoing challenges in American democracy. But for one evening, millions of Americans had witnessed something too rare in contemporary politics: the possibility that confrontation, when rooted in truth and met with accountability, might actually lead to change.